the floor. We will now move on to the next presenter, Cormac Leonard. Hello, Cormac. Your presentation will be on a deaf character. Cormac, over to you. Can everybody see me clearly? I will now share the screen. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. I usually point in the opposite direction of where the presentation is. So hopefully I'm pointing in the right direction now. My presentation, firstly, I'd like to thank the DHC for this opportunity. I have thoroughly enjoyed all the previous presenters. This particular presentation and this person, Cornelius Flahavan, I will use the name sign based on the letters CS. I am not aware of his actual name sign, so I will go with CF. This is random. He was a beggar. It's random. I have Googled this particular character. For many years, he traveled the length and breadth of Ireland. He was a vagrant. He was homeless, walked the streets begging. I know our time is brief and I do not have time to go in detail as to where he is from. I have randomly selected information from the workhouses, the indoor relief registers, prisons, the prisons register, newspaper articles. I have collated data from there. So I have selected this information. I am running on a timeline, which you will be able to see a chronicle of Cornelius Flahavan's life. There are gaps in knowledge of his life. While I do have ample information on him, I still see a lot of gaps. So I'm having to fill in the gaps in some way to get an idea of his life. The information that I have got of him with regard to his name, it was often mentioned in collaboration with his name, the use of deaf mute, deaf and dumb. So that's how I have been able to capture him. The name in itself is rare. So that has made it a lot easier for me to be able to retrieve this information. Some information mentions him as deaf mute, while other information such as court proceedings, it does not state that he is deaf. Also within articles in the newspapers, there was not much published about him. But what information I do have, I will now present on. Prior to the conference beginning, I was speaking with the panel early this morning, speaking about Cornelius Flahavan. An interpreter stated that he was in fact a Kerryman. I, on the other hand, had said because he was from Tarbert, that he was on the border of Limerick. The interpreter stated that Tarbert is in fact Kerry. I have taken a step back from that. I do not want to be involved with the Kerry mafia on those grounds. Anyway, having a little bit of a side joke here. Cornelius Flahavan is from Tarbert, born in 1862. Information that we have on his parents: his father was a gamekeeper who was responsible for looking after the deers. So this was his role. His father died while Cornelius was a young boy, while the mother was pregnant with her 5th child at that time. Cornelius grew up and was identified as being deaf, sent to St. Joseph's in Cabra by the local board of guardians. And that was in a town known as Glynn, and that's where the board of guardians resided. They were willing to fund his time in St. Joseph's. So from 1869, he remained there and returned in and around 1877, 78. It looks like Cornelius had family members who were deaf. This is not a definite, but we can see that there were siblings. There is information from their baptisms records, and also records from St. Joseph's and St. Mary's when people entered into these schools. They were of the same age, the years collaborated. There were 5 children. It would appear that the 4th was hearing and all the other siblings deaf, the eldest being Cornelius Flahavan. However, with the others, it would seem that the relationship was quite touchy. The first occasion when he ended up in court was in Tarbert. This was Tarbert Courthouse, which is now a museum. I have yet to visit here. It's on my list of things to do. In 1878, he was brought to court on the grounds of beating up his younger sister, Mary, who at the time was only 7. So the mother, in a distressed state, got him to court. Now, as to what happened on the day with Cornelius and his mother, it would appear that they did not turn up, that the case may have been dropped. In the same year, 6 months later, again, another sister by the name of Joanna, Cornelius again beat her up, and again they did not turn up in court. So he was not sentenced or given a prison sentence at this stage. Two years later, however, in 1880, it would appear that his aunt, Margaret Flahavan, he threw an iron at her and again was brought to court, charged and imprisoned for 2 months. And he was held in prison in Tralee Jail, which is no longer in existence now. There was an interpreter by the name of Daniel Conway, who was in court. Do not know, is he a family member, somebody that was very good or fluent in sign language. However, he did get a sentence of imprisonment for 2 months. Now, he now started to travel to other countries, which is of great interest. He was on a great adventure. So in 1883, Cornelius' mother decided to emigrate to New York. Cornelius wanted to follow in her footsteps. At the same time, the Glynn Board of Guardians, again, were willing to pay people to emigrate to America. So people were able to travel by boat. Cornelius was one of those who was wanting to go to America, which he did do. He arrived in Boston in the year 1883, in the month of July. and he was on the ship, the Austrian ship. So this is a picture of it here. Set sail to Boston, and let's see what happens next on this infamous misadventure in America. Here we can see that when he arrived, it would seem that he was unable to locate his mother. The money that he did have, he spent very, very quickly. The police then eventually arrested him for begging, sent to the workhouse, maintained there in Massachusetts workhouse, remained there, and while there, those who controlled the workhouse wanted to know what they were going to do with this Irish person and decided to send him back home to Ireland. So this happened 5 months after arriving to America. That adventure only lasted 5 months, on the 18th of December, 1883. So I went locating information for the years 1884 and 85. However, I wasn't able to locate anything until 1886. And I did find a piece of information on a London workhouse. And again, it stated Cornelius Flahavan in these records.
So he stayed there for 2 months, left. 2 days later, came back to Ireland, to Limerick City. And here we have, so he arrived back in Ireland in 1886, and going forward until the 1920s, Cornelius has been found to be traveling all over Ireland, begging, homeless, troublemaker, in court, in prison, in workhouses, for almost 30 years. How incredible. I would have assumed that he would have walked all over Ireland. He may have hitched a ride on the horse and trap. And Veronica said to me recently, it could have been hitchhiking. I think, oh yeah, you might be right. But most of the time, I would imagine that he would have walked around Ireland. What a hard life to have. So here in Ireland, back in the day, there were many workhouses to be found all over Ireland. And Cornelius has had a presence in many of them. Here are some examples of the workhouses that he was found around Ireland. I am sure that there are more, but many of the workhouses and their records in terms of dates, times in, times out, many of them would no longer be available or destroyed. Now, there are some that have been found, and here you can see examples of where Cornelius has been. Now, for most of the time, Cornelius would not stay for very long. He would like 1 night, 2 nights, would come in, would leave. Often. Now, back in the day, homeless people were there of short duration. So the next day they would go looking for either food, boarding, work, and then would come back to the workhouse again for a short period of time. So looking at his court appearances, look at all of the court appearances he's made all over Ireland. This is what I have found. I'm sure there's more that have not been mentioned, but I have no doubt he has made more appearances. So now we're looking at the prison sentences. I'm going to show different examples of where and for how long. So just watch the slides, the next few slides. These are examples of the crimes that he had committed: drunkenness, vagrancy, begging, and so on. But most often it was in relation to drunkenness and begging. I do not have a photo of Cornelius through my research, but the prison records have given a description of what he would have looked like in terms of his head, his hair, his height, his weight. And here are two examples. One was early, the other one was late. And see, you can compare, you can see his height, his eyes. Now, there were some changes that can be cited. His weight, he became slimmer, obviously, with the travels around Ireland. But what was another interesting thing was that it had put in deaf and dumb. Now, where would that fit in? So it was actually marked on the person, so marked on person. But years later, there was a tattoo that was on his left thumb, and it was the sign of the cross, and he also became slightly bald. Now, there are other deaf people that have had many other tattoos that have been sourced, but Cornelius, he only had the one that was on his left thumb. So here we have just one typical year, and I've chosen. Then, as time went on, he went to Waterford Prison and then went on to Wexford. So he was caught for begging, went to court, and sent to prison in Waterford. Left, then went to Rathdrum Workhouse, back to Wicklow again. Then went to Rathdown. So can you see how many nights? So it was 2, 1, 7, and so on. So he was in prison for 7, and then you got a series of 1, 1, 1, and then ended up in Navan. That was just in 1 year on foot. So Cornelius was summoned to court. So let's look at communication. So it looks like Cornelius was well able to write. No mention of interpreters, but always in writing, but something with the same excuse. So as and when he was arrested, it was assumed he was homeless. And he would write and say, no, 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 and would always say, quote unquote. There are 2 different examples that are here on this slide. So the first one you can see is Navan, and then the other one is Dundalk. Both of them with the same excuse. Oh no, I wasn't drunken. I was looking for where I needed to sleep. I couldn't find anything and I was ever so tired. That's all. So he was well able to lie in writing, or he may have been serious, but this is what the newspaper articles would have said. So written by a hearing journalist, but they have known sign language, we don't know. And another interesting point about Cornelius, he would use a false identity. He would change his name. And back then, now how they would know that that person was the same? So if a person was in prison or found in court, is by the writing of information that had been documented. So if a person was arrested, they were asked for their names, they would look through the records and saying, okay, this person was in prison, so they would get a heavier sentence if they were convicted 2 or 3 times. But if they had lied and said, oh, that's a fake identity, or it's a first time, okay, we'll give you a lighter sentence. So Cornelius did have a false identity, and the name that he used was Samuel Sloan. So can you see here on the slide, the prison records, and look at how the name down in the bottom left. So the guards knew, they caught him, and they knew that he had a false identity because of the signatures. So he could no longer use that false identity because he had been identified as using it. So one of the major cases that he had was in 1900, he was arrested for arson. He had gone into a pub, wanted a drink, and he was dismissed. He was refused. He got angry and lit fire to the place. He was arrested. He went to court in Wicklow. He used a false identity by the name of Samuel Sloan. And what was interesting here is that the court had said there is no interpreter, but one gentleman raised his hand and said, I know the dumb alphabet. Now, what was meant by that? Finger spelling? We don't know. But that was what was said. He was accepted as an interpreter. Now, I would assume at that point, it was the two-handed finger spelling. So he would have done the finger spelling. Samuel Sloan would have watched the court proceedings, and Samuel Sloan responds back inside, and the interpreter did not understand what was being said by him. So there was a communication breakdown. So that was the interpreter was actually the newspaper editor. So here we have another example of a few years later, Limavady workhouse. Again, another false identity using Samuel Sloan went into the workhouse, said he was deaf, and goes, oh, did you know that we have the rules? And it was interpreted to him, was what was said. Did they bring in an interpreter, or did they use a book, or did they use gestures? But Samuel Sloan was seen not to be happy with the rules. And the top manager, the master of the workhouse, was annoyed, and Samuel Sloan went to bed and took under the mattress straw and lit the straw, causing a fire. The master had to kick him out of the workhouse. And after that, Samuel Sloan went off on a drunken bridge, was arrested and sent to prison for 7 days. Now, he did have the opportunity of visiting his home in Tarbert. And how do we know that? Is because of the court recordings. He was in court 3 times in Tarbert for drunkenness. So looking at what happened to Cornelius, now he traveled around Ireland for 30 years. He lived rough. Like, that's serious living, isn't it? But based on the research that I have collated, the last piece of information that I have found was from 1920 in the Donegal Union Workhouse. He stayed there, he left, but what happened after that, we do not know. I cannot find any other prison records. Now, he may have died. I have been unable to source a death certificate over a period of time, none to be found. Now, I have looked for him under the 2 names of Cornelius and Samuel, under both, none to be found. So I have a feeling that he was homeless and one night may have died in his sleep. And the next day may have been found, but name unknown. So so it might have a death certificate that says name unknown, but there is no definitive death certificate. And where he is buried, we do not know either. So a pretty sad ending, because he had a hard life, but all credit to him that he was independent traveler for 30 years, was able to make his own decisions, was able to travel around Ireland, you know, making his way through the countryside. He wasn't dependent on the workhouses or stayed there for years. You know, he was very dismissive. So he wasn't in any other institution. He traveled around Ireland on his own. What a man. So there you go. Thank you very much.